The year is 1170, the day is December 29th, and a frigid, unforgiving darkness descends upon the holy city of Canterbury. Inside the cavernous stone heart of the great cathedral, the air is thick with the scent of cold incense and the palpable weight of fear. Here, Archbishop Thomas Becket, once a king's man, now a self-proclaimed soldier of God, prepares for Vespers, the evening prayer. But the prayers that will be heard this night are not those of peace, but of violence. Outside, 4 knights, their armor glinting in the dying light, their minds set on a brutal purpose, are closing in. How did it come to this? How did a friendship forged in power curdle into a hatred that would desecrate this sacred space with blood and brain matter? To understand the crimson stain that would soon pool on the cathedral floor, we must first journey back, not to a scene of hatred, but to one of profound friendship, a bond that defined the early years of a new English dynasty. Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, was a force of nature, a man of boundless energy, ferocious intellect, and a temper that was the stuff of legend. And at his right hand, his closest confidant, was Thomas Becket. Becket was not a man of the cloth then, but a man of the world, a brilliant administrator, a charming courtier, and the king's chancellor. He was Henry's shadow, his enforcer, and his boon companion. Together they hunted in the royal forests, their laughter echoing through the ancient oaks. Together they played chess, their minds locked in strategic combat. Together they governed, a seamless partnership of royal authority and administrative genius, dragging England out of the chaos of civil war and forging a new, stronger state. Becket, the son of a London merchant, lived like a prince, his household a dazzling spectacle of wealth and power that rivaled the king's own. He was the king's man, through and through, his loyalty seemingly absolute, his ambition perfectly aligned with his master's. It was a golden age for both of them, a time of shared purpose and deep personal affection that made the schism to come not just a political rupture, but a devastating personal betrayal. The irony is staggering. The very qualities that made Becket such an effective and worldly chancellor, his meticulousness, his unwavering resolve, his fierce defense of his master's rights, were the same qualities that would later make him such an implacable and unyielding archbishop. The king loved Becket for his strength, never imagining that one day that same strength would be turned against him, creating a conflict that neither man could win, but which only one would survive. The fatal turning point, the grand miscalculation from which all the subsequent horror would flow, came in the year 1162. The Archbishopric of Canterbury, the highest religious office in England, fell vacant. For King Henry, this was a golden opportunity. The Church in England was a state within a state, immensely wealthy and powerful, with its own courts and its own laws, jealously guarding its privileges against royal encroachment. Henry, in his quest to centralize power and establish a single, universal royal law, saw the Church as the primary obstacle. What better way to tame this powerful institution than to place his own man, his most trusted friend and loyal chancellor, at its head? He envisioned a future of perfect cooperation, where the chancellor archbishop would work in tandem with the crown, bending the Church to the king's will. He summoned Becket and informed him of his decision. But Becket, with an eerie foresight, hesitated. He reportedly looked down at his own lavish, secular clothes and told the king, "If this happens, our friendship will soon turn to the bitterest hatred." He knew himself, and he knew the office. He understood that he could not serve two masters. But Henry, blinded by his political ambition and his faith in their personal bond, would not be dissuaded. He insisted, and Becket, for the last time, acquiesced to his master's will. The moment the sacred pallium, the symbol of his office, was laid upon Becket's shoulders, a profound and shocking transformation began. The worldly courtier, the lover of wine and fine clothes, began to morph into a zealous ascetic. He wore a hair shirt beneath his magnificent vestments, a secret act of penance. He gave his lavish feasts to the poor. The king's man was dead, the archbishop was born, and his new master was not in London, but in Rome and in heaven. Henry had not gained a pliant puppet. He had created his most formidable adversary. The first great battle in this new war between the two friends erupted just 2 years later. In 1164, at a royal council held in the cold halls of Clarendon Palace. There, Henry presented what would become known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of 16 articles designed to systematically dismantle the Church's legal autonomy and subordinate it to the Crown. The most contentious of these articles concerned the issue of criminous clerks. For centuries, clergy who committed secular crimes, from theft to murder, could claim benefit of clergy, meaning they could only be tried in the far more lenient ecclesiastical courts, where punishments rarely extended beyond defrocking. For Henry, a king obsessed with law and order, this was an intolerable affront to his authority. He demanded that clerks accused of serious crimes be tried in his royal courts like any other man. For Becket, this was a direct assault on the sacred liberties of the Church, a violation of God's law. He saw himself as the guardian of a sacred trust, and he would not yield. The confrontation was immense. The king, accustomed to obedience, raged and threatened. The bishops, caught between their fearsome king and their unbending archbishop, wavered. At first, under immense pressure, Becket agreed to accept the constitutions in principle, but when presented with the final document, he recoiled and refused to affix his seal. It was a public act of defiance, a line drawn in the sand. The friendship was now officially over, replaced by a cold, hard enmity. The legal dispute over clerical immunity became the symbolic heart of a much larger struggle, the timeless conflict between temporal and spiritual power, between the body of the state and the soul of the Church. Henry was fighting for the principle of a unified kingdom under a single law, while Becket was fighting for the principle of a universal Church, transcendent and independent of earthly kings. The two positions were irreconcilable, and the clash would now escalate, pushing both men towards extremes from which there could be no return. Becket's defiance at Clarendon made his position in England untenable. Facing the full wrath of the king, who now sought to ruin him with trumped-up charges of financial misconduct from his time as Chancellor, Becket made a desperate choice. In the dead of night, he fled England, escaping in a small boat across the Channel to seek refuge in France. Thus began 6 long, bitter years of exile. This was not a quiet retirement. It was a continuation of the war by other means. From the continent, protected by Henry's rival, King Louis VII of France, Becket became a thorn in the side of the English king. He waged a campaign of correspondence, sending letters to the Pope, to the cardinals, and across Europe, pleading his case and condemning Henry's actions. He wielded the terrifying spiritual weapons of his office, threatening to excommunicate the king's chief advisors and even to place the entire Kingdom of England under an interdict, a spiritual strike that would have closed every church and denied the sacraments to every soul. Henry, in turn, responded with a cruelty born of frustration. He seized all of the archbishop's vast estates and revenues. In a particularly vindictive move, he rounded up hundreds of Becket's relatives, friends, and supportersmen, women, and children and banished them from England, forcing them into poverty-stricken exile on the continent, a human flood of misery designed to break Becket's spirit. The Pope, Alexander III, was caught in a diplomatic vice. He sympathized with Becket's defense of church liberties but could not afford to alienate the powerful Henry, whose support he needed against the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope's attempts at mediation were constant but ultimately fruitless. The conflict had become too personal, too deeply enmeshed in the pride and stubbornness of the two men who had once been brothers. The legal principles were still there, but they were now encrusted with layers of personal insult, perceived betrayal, and a burning desire for vindication that overshadowed any hope of rational compromise. The simmering conflict boiled over into a full-blown crisis in June of 1170. King Henry, ever the strategist, decided to secure his dynasty by having his eldest son, Henry the Young King, crowned as his co-ruler. This was a common practice in continental Europe, designed to prevent succession disputes. However, the right to crown an English monarch belonged by ancient and sacred tradition exclusively to the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was the ultimate symbol of the Church's role in legitimizing royal power. For Henry to proceed with the coronation in Becket's absence was a calculated and devastating insult. He instructed the Archbishop of York, Roger de Pont-l'Evêque, a longtime rival of Becket's, to perform the ceremony, assisted by the bishops of London and Salisbury. The act was a public declaration that the king could create kings without the blessing of Canterbury. When news of this ultimate usurpation reached Becket in his French exile, his response was swift and furious. This was not merely a political maneuver. It was a sacrilege, a mortal sin. He immediately persuaded the Pope to grant him the authority to place all of England under an interdict and to excommunicate all the bishops who had participated. The threat of an interdict was the most powerful weapon in the Church's arsenal. It meant that all church doors would be locked, no masses would be said, no marriages consecrated, no baptisms performed, and no dead buried in consecrated ground. It was a spiritual lockdown that would have terrified the deeply pious populace and potentially stirred up a massive rebellion against the king. The sheer scale of this threat finally forced Henry's hand. Faced with spiritual chaos in his kingdom, he knew he had to make peace, or at least a show of peace, with his troublesome archbishop. A fragile, hollow truce was finally brokered at Fréteval in France. The two men met for the first time in years. They dismounted their horses and embraced a public performance of reconciliation for the watching courtiers, but it was a peace built on sand. They deliberately avoided the thorny issue of the constitutions of Clarendon, the root of their entire conflict. Henry agreed to restore Becket to his see and return all the confiscated properties of Canterbury. In return, Becket was to return to England. Yet, even as they spoke of peace, their hearts were still at war. The core issues remained dangerously unresolved, and the personal animosity lingered just beneath the surface of diplomatic smiles. Becket, for his part, was not returning in a spirit of forgiveness. He was now consumed by a righteous, almost fanatical conviction, a belief that he was an instrument of God's will. Before he even set sail for England, he prepared his first act of renewed defiance. He dispatched letters ahead of him, carrying the papal bulls of excommunication for Roger of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury, the men who had dared to perform the young king's coronation. He was returning not as a peacemaker, but as an avenging angel. His friends and supporters were terrified, pleading with him not to go. They warned him that the king's favor was fickle, and that the excommunicated bishops and their powerful allies would surely seek revenge. They told him he was effectively signing his own death warrant. But Becket was resolute, possessed by a powerful sense of destiny and an almost eager embrace of martyrdom. He is reported to have said to the Bishop of Paris, "I am going to England to die." He saw his path clearly, and it did not lead to a comfortable old age, but to a confrontation from which he did not expect to walk away. Upon landing in England in early December, Becket was met with a divided reception that perfectly mirrored the fractured state of the kingdom. For the common people, the monks and the poor, his return was a moment of triumph. They flocked to see him as he made his way to Canterbury, lining the roads, cheering and singing hymns. They saw him not as a political troublemaker, but as their spiritual father, their champion who had stood up to a tyrannical king to defend the faith. He was a returning hero, a living symbol of the Church's power and resilience. But for the powerful barons and the royal officials, his arrival was a harbinger of renewed chaos. The air was thick with menace. The excommunication of the three most powerful bishops had sent shockwaves through the English establishment. The moment the sentence was delivered to them, the disgraced prelates did not wait for the king's justice. They immediately took a ship and made for Normandy, their hearts burning with humiliation and a thirst for revenge. They were going to the king, to his winter court, to present their side of the story. And they would not be presenting it with calm reason. They would paint a picture of a triumphant, arrogant Becket, a man who had returned to England not to heal the wounds of the kingdom, but to tear it apart with his pride. They would tell the king that this low-born clerk was stirring up the common people, that he was acting like a king himself, and that his ultimate goal was to usurp the authority of the crown. They were fanning the embers of Henry's famous Angevin temper, a rage that, once unleashed, was known to be uncontrollable, a storm of fury that left devastation in its wake. The pieces were now moving into their final, fatal alignment. We must now journey across the Channel to the king's court at the castle of Beures, near Bayeux in Normandy. Imagine the scene. The great hall is cold, the stone walls sweating with damp, the air thick with the smoke of torches, and the smell of roasting meat and mulled wine. But there is no festive cheer in the heart of King Henry II. He is pacing, a caged lion, his mind consumed by the news from England. The three excommunicated bishops, Roger of York, Gilbert of London, and Jocelyn of Salisbury, have arrived, and they have poured their venomous, self-serving account into the king's ear. They depicted Becket's return not as a reconciliation, but as an invasion. They claimed he was traveling with a force of armed men, that he was plotting to take the crown from the young king's head. They twisted his every action into an act of treason. Henry, a man of volcanic emotions, listened as his anger mounted. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged, his grand plan for peace shattered. All the frustration of the past 6 years, all the hatred for the man who was once his dearest friend, boiled over. He fell into one of his legendary rages, a state of temporary madness where he was said to have rolled on the floor, chewing the rushes. And then, at the height of his fury, surrounded by his loyal household knights, he roared out the words that would echo through history, a cry of pure, impotent rage that would be interpreted as a royal command. The exact phrasing is lost to time, but the sentiment is chillingly clear. What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk? The words, heavy with menace, hung in the cold air. It was not a direct order for murder, but in the charged, violent atmosphere of a medieval court, it was something far more dangerous, an implicit license to kill. In the seething silence that followed the king's outburst, 4 men exchanged glances. They were not miserable drones. They were loyal household knights, men of action and ambition, their fortunes tied directly to the king's favor. Their names are etched in infamy. Reginald Fitzurse, a man whose name ironically meant son of a bear. Hugh de Morville, a powerful lord from the north. William de Tracy, a knight with a history of violence. And Richard le Breton, a follower of the king's brother. They heard the king's words not as a lament, but as a call to action, a royal wish that it was their duty to fulfill. To rid the king of this troublesome priest would be the ultimate act of loyalty, an act that would surely be rewarded with lands, titles, and immense gratitude. Without seeking further clarification, perhaps fearing the king might cool down and rescind his implied order, they quietly slipped away from the royal court. Their purpose was singular and grim. They rowed hard for the coast and took the first available ship, a silent, determined quartet bound by a terrible secret. As their vessel cut through the choppy gray waters of the English Channel, they were racing against time. They were racing against the possibility of a messenger from a regretful king, a king who, having vented his rage, might already be horrified by the potential consequences of his words, but no such messenger came. The knights were alone with their interpretation, their ambition, and their swords. Their journey was a grim passage from the heat of a king's anger to the cold reality of the act they were about to commit, an act that would solve the king's problem but would plunge his kingdom and his soul into a crisis far deeper than any he had faced before. On the fateful day of December 29th, the 4 knights arrived in Canterbury, their horses steaming in the winter air. They were a menacing presence, their allegiances clear to all. They first made their way to the Archbishop's palace, adjacent to the cathedral. They were armed, but they did not immediately draw their swords. Their first strategy was one of intimidation. They burst into Becket's chamber where he had just finished his dinner. They threw themselves down on the floor without greeting him, a calculated insult. Then Fitzurse, acting as spokesman, began the confrontation. He declared they had a message from the king. They demanded that Becket travel immediately to Winchester to account for his actions and, most importantly, that he lift the sentences of excommunication from the bishops. Becket listened, his composure unnerving. He was no longer the frightened man who had fled England 6 years earlier. He was calm, resolute, and utterly defiant. He refused their demands, stating that the excommunications had been sanctioned by the Pope and only the Pope could absolve them. He argued with them, point for point, asserting the spiritual authority of his office over the temporal demands of the king. The knights, unaccustomed to being contradicted, grew enraged by his steadfast refusal. Their threats escalated. Becket remained unmoved, at one point shouting at Fitzurse, "You threaten me in vain. Were all the swords in England hanging over my head? You could not terrify me from my obedience to God." The argument reached a fever pitch, and the knights, realizing they could not break his will with words, stormed out, shouting that they would be back. They went to a sycamore tree in the palace garden to retrieve the swords and axes they had hidden there. The monks, now in a state of sheer terror, pleaded with Becket to flee into the cathedral to seek sanctuary. They began to bar the heavy doors of the palace, but Becket forbade it. In a moment of supreme, fatalistic courage, he commanded them to unbar the doors, declaring, "The Church of God is not to be defended like a fortress. I will not have it made a castle." He was consciously choosing his ground and his destiny. As the late afternoon sun cast long, cold shadows across Canterbury, the cathedral bells began to toll for vespers. The monks, their faces pale with fear, practically had to force the archbishop from his palace, urging him towards the sanctuary of the great church. They believed, as did all of medieval society, that the sanctity of the cathedral, the very house of God, would protect him. To shed blood on consecrated ground was an unthinkable sin, a sacrilege of the highest order. They hurried him through the cloisters and into the north transept of the vast, darkening cathedral. But the peace of the evening prayer was about to be brutally shattered. The sound of the chanting monks was suddenly drowned out by the terrifying crash of a door being smashed open. The four knights, now clad in full mail, their helmets hiding their faces, their drawn swords glinting in the candlelight, stormed into the sacred space. They were no longer men, they were engines of destruction. The terrified congregation and most of the monks scattered like birds, screaming, hiding behind pillars and in dark chapels. Only a few loyal attendants, including his cross-bearer Edward Grimm, remained by Becket's side. In the echoing silence of the cavernous transept, Fitzurse's voice boomed, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the realm?" From the gloom, standing near a pillar before the altar of St. Benedict, Becket stepped forward. There was no fear in his voice, only a profound and steady calm. He answered, his voice ringing with authority, "Here I am, no traitor but a priest of God. What do you want?" The final confrontation had begun. The knights, momentarily taken aback by his courage, tried to seize him, to drag him outside. Their intention, even at this late stage, was likely to kill him away from the sacred altar, to avoid the full horror of desecrating the cathedral itself. "You are a dead man," they shouted, grabbing at his robes. But Becket resisted. He was a tall, strong man, and he clung fiercely to a central pillar, refusing to be moved. The scene descended into a chaotic, violent scuffle. Fitzurse, enraged by the resistance, raised his sword. Edward Grimm, the loyal monk, threw up his own arm to block the blow, but the force of the strike was so great that it sliced through Grimm's arm and struck the archbishop on the head, knocking off his cap and drawing the first blood. Becket, seeing his own blood, wiped it from his face and prayed aloud, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Then William de Tracy struck the second blow, a heavy strike to the same spot. Becket staggered but did not yet fall. He was on his knees, his head bowed as if in prayer. It was de Tracy who delivered the third blow, and with this, the archbishop collapsed forward onto the stone pavement. He was dying, but the knight's bloodlust was not yet sated. It was Richard le Breton who delivered the final, most savage stroke. With a powerful overhand swing, he shouted, "Take that, for the love of my Lord William, the king's brother!" The blow was so ferocious that it sliced off the entire crown of Becket's skull, and the tip of le Breton's sword shattered on the hard stone floor. The deed was done, but one final grotesque act of desecration remained. Hugh of Horsey, a subdeacon who had entered with the knights, placed his foot on the neck of the dead archbishop, and with the point of his own sword, he deliberately scooped out the pooling brains and scattered them across the flagstones, a final, unimaginable insult to the fallen priest. The four knights, their brutal work finished, fled into the gathering darkness, their armor splattered with the blood and brains of the man they had just butchered. They left behind a scene of almost indescribable horror: the desecrated altar, the shattered sword tip, and the mutilated body of the archbishop lying in a pool of his own blood on the cold stone floor. For a moment, a stunned silence filled the cathedral, broken only by the sound of a rising storm that was said to have broken over Canterbury at the very moment of Becket's death. Then, slowly, the monks and townspeople who had been hiding emerged, their shock turning to grief and horror. They gathered around the body, weeping, dipping cloths into the sacred blood, already recognizing that they were in the presence not just of a murdered man, but of a holy martyr. The news of the assassination spread with astonishing speed, first across England and then throughout Christendom, carried by horrified pilgrims and messengers. The reaction was one of universal shock and revulsion. To murder an archbishop, unarmed, in his own cathedral during Vespers, was an act that transcended politics and entered the realm of monstrous sacrilege. When the news reached King Henry in Normandy, he was reportedly devastated. He shut himself in his room for 3 days, refusing to eat or speak, overcome with what appeared to be genuine grief and remorse. Was it the guilt of a man who knew his angry words had led directly to this horror? Or was it the cold fear of a politician who understood the catastrophic consequences that would follow? In death, Becket achieved a victory that had eluded him in life. The Pope immediately declared him a saint, and his tomb in Canterbury became the most important pilgrimage site in northern Europe, a place of miraculous healings. The political fallout for Henry was disastrous. He was forced to perform a humiliating public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be flogged by monks at Becket's tomb. He had to formally renounce the constitutions of Clarendon, the very source of the conflict. In the end, the murder massively strengthened the power and independence of the Church, the very thing Henry had fought so long and so ruthlessly to crush. The blood of the martyr proved to be a far more potent force than the sword of the king.